Scholars. I am so glad to be joining you again for another mini lesson of the day. Today's topic we are going to be talking about is rounding. And so now once again you might be saying, Miss Shepherd, rounding is so easy. And I'm glad to hear that, but you might be listening and watching with your little siblings. And so this is a great opportunity for them to learn about rounding also. Again, all you're going to need today is a sheet of paper and a pen or a pencil. So if you don't have that, go ahead and go and grab that right now. Pause the video and we can get started. Our objective of today's mini lesson is that students will be able to round multi-digit whole numbers. Now, if you think about it, when we learned about rounding, this was all the way back in August. So we're gonna really have to activate that part of our brain to remember all that we've learned. So I'm gonna do a little bit of a refresher, and then I'll give you some problems to work on at home on your own at the end. So let's just recall, what is rounding? When I think about what does it mean to round? And rounding is when you find a number that is close to a given number. So questions you might hear when you're thinking about rounding, you might hear, what is the nearest 10? Or round to the nearest 100? Or what's the nearest million? Those are all questions that you could hear on a test or on a worksheet asking about rounding. So the first thing when it comes to rounding is that we find benchmark numbers. Benchmark numbers. And whenever we round numbers, it's helpful to locate the benchmark numbers on the number line. So remember, before we ever got to the point where we could round with just our brains, we would round on a number line to help us visualize what we saw and the rounding that was taking place. And so we can use a number line to help us. If we are rounding to the nearest 10, the benchmark numbers we're gonna use are the nearest multiples of 10, such as 10, 20, and 30, and so on. So 10, 20, 30, you'll see my number line here shows that. Then there's something called the midpoint, and we used to do all of these exercises and drills about what is a midpoint. And a midpoint always comes directly in between the two benchmark numbers, the middle, right in the middle. So if I'm thinking in my brain, what would the midpoint be between 10 and 20? Okay, what is halfway between 10 and 20? What is the midpoint between 10 and 20? Pause the video, think about it, and then write it down, and then go ahead and tell me. So if the midpoint of 10 and 20 would be 15, hopefully you got that right. So let's go ahead and think about this one. What would the midpoint be between 20 and 30? Pretty easy. I'm gonna think, what is halfway between 20 and 30? Halfway between 20 and 30 is 25. 25. So in our first question, it says, what is the midpoint between 10 and 20? Our benchmark numbers there are 10 and 20. In the second question, it said, what would the midpoint be between 20 and 30? Our benchmark numbers there are 20 and 30. So just remember, when we go to round on a number line, we are going to find our benchmark numbers and our midpoint, and then we'll be able to round. Let's round 54 to the nearest 10, So if we were to do this together in class, you would see I've written 50, I've written 60, those are my two benchmark numbers. And then I said, you know what I said? My midpoint is 55 because that's halfway between 50 and 60. So written my midpoint, got my two benchmark numbers. Now I want you to pause the video and I want you to draw this. So I'll move out of the way, draw this, and then I want you to think in your mind, where are you going to place 54 on this number line? Is it going to be before your midpoint or after your midpoint? Before or after? So go ahead and pause this to draw it. Now, hopefully you've paused and you're able to see that 54 is going to go before our midpoint. So I'm thinking back, what does that mean if 54 goes before the midpoint? Well, then that means that we actually round down. So 54 rounded to the nearest 10 is going to be 50. It's going to be 50. Now let's try another one. Let's round 166 to the nearest 100. So we're just taking it up another level. What I would love for you to do right now is go ahead and pause the video, draw out this blank number line, and I want you to find your two benchmark numbers. Remember, we're rounding to the nearest 100. And then I want you to find your midpoint. So go ahead, pause, take a few seconds to do that, and then I'll be able to show you what's next. So hopefully you've paused, and you will see that our two benchmark numbers, because we're rounding to the nearest 100, are going to be 100 and 200, and my midpoint is going to be 150. And so what I need you to think about is, where am I going to place 166 on this number line? Am I going to place it before my midpoint or after my midpoint? Before or after? So you're thinking about that right now. I want you to pause. I want you to place 166 on your number line. Once you've done that, awesome. Let's go ahead and look. 166 is going to go after our midpoint. Hopefully you got that right, and you can give yourself a little pat on the back. 166 is after our midpoint, and I remember that if it's after my midpoint, I am going to round up. So 166 to the nearest 100 is 200. So here are just some observations that we've made in recalling what we know about rounding. So we've learned and we remembered that any number at or above the midpoint, we're going to round up. Any number below the midpoint, we're going to round down. So sometimes we, after we really got comfortable back in August with rounding with a number line, we began to round without a number line, and we would underline what we were rounding to and circle the number next to it, which would allow us to determine what to round to. So if I was rounding 85 to the nearest 10, I would underline the 8, I would circle the 5, and I would think of these two little rules, which are 5 or more, I add 1 more, 4 or less, I let it rest. So stop. Go ahead and tell me what you think I'm going to do, 5 or more or 4 or less. Hopefully you said 5 or more, I add 1 more. So if I added 1 more to 85, I would round it to 90. Remember, everything after the underline becomes a 0. 110 to the nearest 100. And so some of you might be able to see this without even doing the underline and the circle. You can visualize it on a number line, or you can just visualize it in your head, which is great. But anytime I'm struggling, I can always place it on a number line, or I can underline and circle. And so I underline the 1, and then I circle the 1, and I'm thinking, 1, that's 4 or less, I let it rest. So that 1 stays the same, the rest becomes zeros, and 110 rounded to the nearest 100 is going to be 100. So on this page, this is independent practice. So what I need you to do is make sure that, again, you have a pen and a piece of paper and you are ready to go. So what I've gone ahead and done is I've gone ahead and labeled the ones in orange that I would like you to visualize and show the rounding on a number line. And I said to remember that you're going to solve using a number line. You're going to find your benchmark numbers and then your midpoint, and then you're going to place that number either before or after the midpoint. The ones that aren't highlighted in orange, you can do them however you like. If you would like to visualize them on a number line, great. If you want to do the underline and circle process, awesome. If you can do it all in your brain, all by yourself, great. Go ahead and just make sure that you show your work. And I've told you what to round them to. So you've got some nearest tens, nearest hundreds, and then I decided to make it a little bit spicier at the end, and I did nearest 1,000, nearest 10,000, and then nearest 100,000. So go ahead and pause it here and make sure you get all these numbers written down. Feel free to share with me what you got. I'm excited to hear. I'm excited to see your answers and your thinking. And hopefully this lesson was super great for you guys and that you got a little refresher on rounding. Bye.